Okay, so for our intermission tonight, we will be going back to a little bit of story time again. You guys enjoyed this the last time, so we're going to do a little bit more again tonight. What I want to do is we will continue going through some of the stories that I had not done, which includes, well, let's see. I did the furry collar, I did the 10 claws, and I did the fortune teller. You guys tell me. This time we'll just go with the first one that I see. Which one do you guys want me to read first? And we're going to do this for a little bit before we switch over to the other game. And again, there are more stories in this book, but I specifically picked out, because there's like 15, 16 stories in here. I had chosen a select few for a reason, though. Ooh, Edge says, a free place to sleep. I don't have dust, and I don't have a fire. So we'll just have to make do. But Edge says, a free place to sleep, which I like this one, too. I mean, of course, I picked it, but just for one specific imagery. Okay. So, again, we are reading from Tales for the Midnight Hour, by J.B. Stamper. And for the first story tonight here, guys, we're going to read A Free Place to Sleep. And again, like last time, I'll be going just straight on reading through. Feel free to chat as we go along, of course, but I will not interrupt the actual story. I will just read from start to finish. So, here we go. A Free Place to Sleep. It was 2 a.m. in London, England. Tom and Dave were wandering through the streets like two sleepwalkers. They had inquired at hotel after hotel. None had vacancies. Now their footsteps echoed eerily through the empty, narrow streets of the city. I thought London didn't have fogs anymore, Dave grumbled. During the last hour, a foggy mist had been settling over the city. It was getting difficult for them to see the hotel signs, and harder yet to see the street signs. I've got to find some place to lie down, Tom moaned. I don't care where. I just can't go any farther. But go on they did, straining their eyes through the fog to find a place to stay. They walked from Piccadilly Circus to Green Park. Then they headed north to Oxford Street. As they were walking down a street lined with old four-story buildings, they saw a sign. It was hanging on the black iron fence in front of the building. For sale, it read. Listen, I've got an idea, Tom said. This place is probably vacant. What do you say we break in here and sleep for the night? I'm ready to try anything, Dave answered. The iron fence had sharp spikes on the top. The two climbed over the fence carefully, putting their feet on the iron crossbars and then leaping over the spiked points. It was a tricky thing to do, tired as they were. Once over the fence, they tiptoed up to the front of the building. Through one of the windows, they could see that the rooms were being remodeled. It's empty, just as I thought, Tom whispered. Yeah, but how are we going to get in? Dave asked. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out his Swiss Army knife. He wedged the knife between the top and bottom window and turned the old brass lock. Then he pushed the bottom section open. Tom looked at Dave with a smug grin of satisfaction. The two boys hoisted themselves up onto the window ledge and then climbed into the room. I don't want to sleep here, Dave said, looking around the room. Too many nails and tools lying around. Okay, we'll check out the other rooms, Tom said. They went out into the hallway in the old house. The cramped stair twisted upwards like the stairs in an old Amsterdam canal house. Tom started up and Dave followed. On the second floor, they tried the doors on all the rooms. Everything was bolted. They climbed up to the third floor. Again, all the rooms were bolted shut. Looks like there's one more floor, Tom said, looking up the staircase. Let's go. They trudged up the final flight of stairs wearily. Dave was starting to complain again about being tired. On the top landing, there was only one door. The roof slanted steeply in on all sides. Tom tried the doorknob. To his relief, it opened. The two boys entered the small room. In it were two single beds and a dresser. A window overlooked the street below. Not bad, Tom said. He walked over to a stand and lit the candle that stood on it. Dave fell down on one of the old beds in exhaustion. Just then, a loud bang echoed up from the staircase from below them. Dave jumped up. What was that? Tom crept out into the hallway and stood there for a minute. Then he came back into the room. I think it was just the window we came in. It fell shut. We forgot to close it, didn't we? Oh yeah, Dave said, sitting down on one of the beds again. This place gives me the creeps, though. Come on, Tom said. It's a free place to sleep, isn't it? They both lay down on the beds. Tom lit a cigarette and then reached over and blew out the candle. As the light was extinguished, a weird cackle, almost like a laugh, seemed to come from the ceiling. Was that you, Tom? Dave asked, sitting up in his bed. No, Tom said, and his voice uneasy. I think it was just something on the roof. Maybe we should get out of here, don't you think? Dave asked. Tom leaned back down in his bed. And go where? They were both quiet for a while. I mean, maybe this place is haunted or something, Dave said in the darkness. Be quiet and go to sleep. Dave stopped talking, but then something else broke the silence. It was the sound of feet moving up and down the staircase, but the feet were moving faster than any human feet ever could. The footsteps seemed to slide and slither, glide up and down the stairs. I want to get out of here, Dave insisted in a panicked voice. Okay, let's go. Tom jumped out of bed and lit the candle. Just then, doors started slamming downstairs, the doors that had been locked before, and the weird cackle came up again, this time from the hallway. I'm afraid to go out there now, Dave said to Tom. He looked scared. Yeah, maybe we better stay in here. Tom walked over to the door. There was an iron bolt on it. He slid the bolt across the door frame. Nobody's going to get in through here. Tom went back and sat down on his bed. He tried to avoid Dave's eyes. He could tell that Dave was freaking out. He didn't feel so brave himself. Listen, we're okay, he said. There was a rattling sound from the door. The two boys' eyes were fixed on the doorknob. It was moving back and forth. No. Dave was shaking with fright on his bed. At least the bolt is there, Tom said to himself. But then, by its own will, it seemed, the bolt slid back from the door frame. The two boys watched with horror as the door slowly, ever so slowly, moved open. After a few inches, it stopped. There was dead silence. Then the cackle, the weird, sick cackle, penetrated the room, and through the narrow opening of the door, a shapeless green blob began to ooze. Dave was frozen against the wall at the head of his bed. Tom jumped up and stood in a corner. More of the blob oozed in. It was like slimy green jelly. It had a smell of evil. Then, suddenly, a head appeared out of the green ooze. The head had a horrible face, a face covered with knife wounds. The cackle came from the face. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the head disappeared back into the green blob. On the bed, Dave was making choking sounds in his throat. He was trying to scream, but he couldn't. The blob oozed through the air toward him. It seemed drawn on by his fear. Standing in the corner, Tom saw his chance to escape. He moved slowly against the wall until he was near the door. Then he ran for it. As he passed near the blob, he felt something cold and slimy swish along his arm. He turned back to see Dave's face staring at him. It had the look of death on it. Tom ran harder. He almost fell down the steps to the front room. The window was there. The window they had climbed in was still open. He jumped out of it. Then he hurled himself across the spiked fence. On the street, he looked up at the attic room. He couldn't see anything, but the weird cackle floated down to him. Tom didn't know what to do. He ran out into the foggy street. He stopped for a moment. Then, behind him, he heard Dave scream in agony. Tom started running again. He ran until he came to St. James Park. Then he still kept running and running. London, 21st of June. Early this morning, police found the body of 18-year-old Dave Moore impaled on the spike fence in front of 50 Berkeley Square. The 4-story window of the house was gaping open. Homicide detectives believe the young American was pushed from the small attic room. His traveling companion, 18-year-old Tom Dodd, is being sought for questioning. Suicide was ruled out because of the victim's body showed signs of a struggle. Although 50 Berkeley Square has been long known as a haunted house, the homicide squad told reporters that Scotland Yard does not believe in ghosts. You know, rereading that now, it's okay. The thing that gets me is the fact that you hear him scream and then you find out he was impaled on the spiked fence. As a kid, that imagery stood with me. Which is why I liked that story, just because the end, just picturing that. Also, hey, Shimmy, yes, I am back. Stranger. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Hey, Shimmy, since you're here, or anyone else, let's do another story or two before we move on to the next game. Again, we've done the furry collar, we've done the 10 claws, we've done the fortune teller, and we've done a free place to sleep, which means we have the black velvet ribbon, the old plantation, the train through Transylvania, and the stuffed dog. I did just do the one. I did a free place to sleep. So if anyone will pick any of the 4 remaining, we will do that one next. I should have crossed out the different ones. I should have edited the image and crossed out the ones we'd already done before. You vote for the old plantation. You don't remember this one? All right, old plantation it is. That is on page 55. That's on page 55. My IQ is 55. Girlfriend's age 55. All right. It's not the one from the Tales from the Crypt, or is it? Okay, the old plantation. Jonas Ellerby turned his car into the plantation driveway at twilight. The long path from the road to the house was lined with giant cedar trees. Spanish moss drooped from their branches. The grass along the driveway had long ago turned to weeds. Now, already, the color of things was fading with the light. The trees were more like silhouettes, like shadows against the sky. Jonas felt the atmosphere of the place around him. He was a northerner. This landscape was new and strange to him. The driveway took a sudden, sharp turn, and the house appeared. Jonas drew in his breath as he saw it. The house was not what he had expected. He had gotten his idea of southern plantations from Hollywood movies. Jonas stopped the car and turned off the engine. He stared at the great sweep of the house. Its long veranda stretched out underneath tall, white pillars. Window after window stared at him like curious eyes. In one, Jonas thought he saw a light go out. Then he decided it must have been his reflection. A reflection. Jonas looked up at the second story of the house. Something was wrong with it. The room sagged at a crazy angle to one side. The roof looked like as though it had been blown on by too many storms. And the color of the house was not the blinding bright whiteness of the plantations in the movies. It was a dull gray, an almost rotten gray color. It was a dying house, and Jonas had come to bury it. Jonas represented the firm of Stanton & Stanton. The firm represented the estate of Mr. Wigover, the former owner of the house. The estate had gone into bankruptcy. Jonas had come to make plans to tear down the old house and sell off the land to a real estate dealer. Even though people had warned him that the house had a strange reputation, he had come this evening to spend the night in it. Jonas got out of his car and slammed the car door shut. He decided he would explore the premises in the fading twilight. He followed the stone path up to the house and then walked up the deteriorating steps onto the veranda. An old rocking chair sat there, moving slightly in the evening breeze. Jonas put the key he had been given into the front door lock. To his relief, the door opened. As he stepped inside, Jonas was overwhelmed by the smell of dampness and decay. The air seemed steeped in the odor of age. He wondered how long it had been since another human had stepped foot inside this house. He walked past the grand stairway which swept up to the second story, and he entered a sitting room full of dusty, moldy furniture. His footsteps echoed on the bare floors as he went from room to room. The dining room, the ballroom, the study, the kitchen. Just as he had made his way back to the front door, Jonas passed a room he hadn't entered before. He opened the door and peeked in. It was a small bedroom, sparsely decorated and neat. The sheets and pillowcases were no longer fresh, but obviously clean. And this room didn't have the damp smell to it. Jonas stood and looked around the room for a moment. Then he smiled and went to go get his luggage from the car. By the time he had unpacked his things for the night and put them away, twilight had faded into night. Jonas knew the house had no electricity, but he saw that there was a partially burned candle on the nightstand by the bed. As he fumbled with his matches in the darkness, he heard a chorus of crickets begin their shrill evening song. The candle blazed the light. That is when he first noticed the book. It was sitting on the nightstand, as if someone had laid it out for him. The title on the faded cover was The Old Plantation. Jonas decided he might read it later, when he turned in for the night. Before that, though, Jonas thought he would go out to the veranda one last time. As he walked out into the night air, he sensed a change in the atmosphere. He no longer felt just a few miles away from civilization. He felt isolated, as though there was something to be... He felt isolated, and there seemed to be a different sense of time around the old plantation. The trees with the drooping Spanish moss closed in around the house, and there were no other sounds than the breathing of the trees in the dark and the piercing song of the crickets. Jonas moved nervously across the veranda. If he had known it would be like this, he wouldn't have come out. He felt something alight on his face. Before he could brush it away, the mosquito had drawn his blood. Jonas felt his temple swelling with the bite. He decided to go back into the house. Back in the bedroom, Jonas climbed into bed. He was shivering now. The candle on the nightstand was still burning. As he looked over it, his eyes again fell upon the book, and he picked it up. As he settled himself into bed, Jonas opened the pages to the first chapter. He read. The story is about a young man, a northerner, who comes to the south on business. One night, he drives his car up to an old southern plantation. He decides to spend the night in the old house, even though he is all alone there. Jonas slammed the book shut and laid it back down on the nightstand. He reached over and lit his pipe. His hands were shaking now as he struck for another match. Then he lay back on the bed, taking long draws on his pipe. He could not get the strange coincidence of the book out of his mind. It made him nervous, but it made him curious too. He reached over and picked up the book again. In the story, the young man had just turned in for the night. After having gone out on the veranda for a while, his face was still swollen from a mosquito bite he had gotten there. He scratches his bite. Jonas caught himself scratching the bite on his own face. His hands began to tremble so badly that he couldn't hold the book still. He looked up at the ceiling of the room. There was a roach crawling high on the wall. He looked over at the window. A pale moon was shining in the sky. The chorus of crickets still came from the swamp. Jonas was sweating. He wondered what the book was going to tell next. He began to read once again. The young man in the story sees a book by his bedstand. The title of the book is The Old Plantation. He picks it up and begins to read. As he reads the first chapter, his face takes on a look of fear. Then slowly, a look of understanding comes over his face. Jonas stopped reading again. He felt the skin crawling on the back of his neck. What was it that the man in the story understood? Why didn't he understand? Jonas's mind began to throb with a terrible anxiety. He went back to the book. The old man continues to read The Old Plantation. The more he reads, the more frightened he becomes. Finally, he finishes the book. Then, the young man lays the book back down on the nightstand. He knows there is nothing he can do but wait. Eagerly, Jonas turned the next page of The Old Plantation, but the next page and the next page and the next page were blank. The rest of the book was blank. Jonas put it back on the nightstand. Jonas lay in his bed and waited. He was shaking all over now. What was he waiting for? Suddenly, Jonas was aware that the crickets had stopped, and there was a dead silence. In the moonlight, the trees looked frozen stiff. Everything seemed to have stopped. Then, Jonas heard a car coming up the driveway toward the old plantation. He leaned over and blew out the candle beside his bed. He didn't know what to do but wait. He waited, without moving, while he heard the engine stop and the car door slam. He waited as he heard a key being put into the front door. He waited, trembling under the covers, while he listened to the footsteps going throughout the house, and then stopping in front of his bedroom. Then, as the doorknob turned and the door opened, Jonas finally understood what he had been waiting for. It was himself, standing in the doorway, looking at the clean little room. On the nightstand beside the bed, he saw a partially burned candle and an old book. He smiled to himself, thinking he might read the book after a walk on the veranda. Then Jonas Ellerby went to get his luggage from the car. He had decided to spend the night at the old plantation. That one's kind of a Twilight Zone kind of a thing to it. Old Jonas gets stuck in a loop that seems to have no end. But what happens to the Jonas who's experiencing it from the bed? I don't know. Also, stop the music real quick. Again, I mentioned this in the last time we did this. Most of the stories, the twist comes at the end. Basically all of them, really. But I mean, they're short stories for kids. What do you expect? You're expecting the screen to suddenly go, hit this button. No, I don't have anything that elaborate set up for you guys. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these stories, Shimmy, I'm sure, like, if you were to hear them, you're like, okay, yeah, I remember them. But I know for you and I especially, there were certain ones that especially stuck with us. Also, hey, Donut. Yes, we actually just did the second story. I want to do one more for tonight. I don't want these sections to be too long because I'm more about the games, but these are nice little intermissions. Donut, I'm going to go ahead and let you choose. Between the stories we have left, would you like to hear The Black Velvet Ribbon, The Train Through Transylvania, or The Stuffed Dog? I'm going to let Donut pick. Unless you don't want to pick Donut, in which case someone else can. But any one of those three. I mean, I have Goosebump books, but those aren't going to be short enough. The whole point of this little story time intermission is short little stories that I can use to fill in some time. Technically tonight, this isn't to like fill the gap of like, oh, well, it's not enough time to start a new game, but I have a little bit of time left that I want to use. This one was like straight intentionally just going to be the intermission for the 2 short games I have for tonight. The Train Through Transylvania, page 68. This is going to be the last story for the intermission here. And then we're going to go on to the next game. The Train Through Transylvania. The train jerked to a halt in the foothills of Transylvania. Inside one of the small compartments, Stephanie Archer looked nervously out the window. "I wonder what's the matter," she asked. Her mother and brother, sitting across from her, both shrugged their shoulders. "I'm glad it's still daylight," Stephanie said, looking out at the dense green forest around them. "Scared of vampires?" her brother asked. "Oh, sure," Stephanie answered sarcastically. "Well then, you won't mind if I read to you from Dracula, will you? I thought it was fitting, us riding through Transylvania." Mrs. Archer sighed. "Really, Robert?" Then the slow grinding of the wheels against the track began again. Soon the train had picked up to its normal speed. Stephanie settled back against the old velvet seat and relaxed. Robert pulled a battered copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula from his knapsack. Mrs. Archer went on reading her novel. The 3 of them had the compartment, which could sit 6, all to themselves. Robert began to read aloud from Dracula. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been half renewed, for the white hair and mustache were changed to dark iron gray. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran over the chin and neck. "Oh, stop it, Robert," Stephanie interrupted. "I was just trying to set the mood for our journey," Robert protested. "Here we are in the heart of vampire country. We might as well enjoy it." "Robert, stop reading aloud if it bothers Stephanie," Mrs. Archer insisted. "We'll be meeting your father in Bucharest tomorrow, thank goodness. Then I'm turning both of you over to him." Robert picked up Dracula again and started to read, silently. Stephanie gazed out the window. The train was climbing out of a valley into the mountains. "Listen to this!" Robert exclaimed and started to read aloud again. It seemed as if the whole awful creature was simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech. "Mother, make him stop it!" I'll stop, Robert said hastily. "I didn't know you were so sensitive, Stephanie." Just then, this train came to another halt. All 3 of them looked out to see where they were. The station sign read, Mihadia. "Quite a few people are getting on," Robert said, craning his head out the window. "I hope no one comes in here," Stephanie said. But a minute later, they heard footsteps in the corridor, and the door of the compartment slid open. A short, well-dressed elderly man stuck his head inside. "May I join you? I'm afraid the other compartments are full." "Of course," Mrs. Archer said. "Please, come in." The elderly man sat down by the door, beside Stephanie. "My name is Dr. Moore. You are Americans, are you not?" "Yes, that's right. I'm Mrs. Rita Archer. This is my daughter Stephanie and my son Robert." The old man beamed and smiled at everyone. "Very happy to meet you." The train jerked forward and then began to pull out of the station. "Where do you—" Mrs. Archer began to say to the doctor, but she stopped as the compartment door slid open again. A tall, middle-aged man walked into the compartment. He didn't say a word. Without hesitation, he walked to the window and sat down on the other side of Stephanie. Stephanie glanced at the new man sitting beside her. She saw his black hair, white skin, and red lips. They were red, those lips, ruby red. Stephanie looked over to Robert. Robert met her gaze and raised his eyebrows. The second stranger's presence invaded the entire compartment. No one seemed to know what to say. Stephanie moved over on the seat, closer to the old doctor. It had suddenly seemed to her that the dark stranger's body was cold. Unnaturally cold. She started to shiver and couldn't stop. "Robert, could you get me a sweater?" Sure, Steph." Robert stood up to get a sweater from the overhead rack. As he did, the copy of Dracula fell from his lap onto the floor at the stranger's feet. Robert stooped to pick it up. but the stranger already had it in his bony hand. He gave it back to Robert. There was a smirk on his face, and his hard, black eyes looked deep into Robert's. Robert sat down again, forgetting about the sweater. Mrs. Archer handed over her sweater to Stephanie. Then she said to the doctor, "It's always nice to have a doctor around." The old doctor smiled kindly. Everyone settled back into an awkward silence. The strange man sat perfectly beside Stephanie. As the light began to fade in the sky, his white face took on a greater contrast to his black hair and black suit. Stephanie cast quick glances at him as she pretended to stare intently out the window. She couldn't get the words from Dracula out of her mind. This man was so strange, and they were in Transylvania. "Robert," Mrs. Archer said softly, "could you switch on the light, please? It's getting difficult to read." As Robert reached to flick up on the light switch, the doctor reached over and touched his arm. "Please, Mrs. Archer, wait a few more minutes with the light if you don't mind. As a frequent traveler through these parts, I can recommend watching the countryside now. It is twilight, near sunset. The sky will be full of beautiful colors in the next half hour. You really shouldn't miss it." "Of course, Doctor," Mrs. Archer agreed. Stephanie leaned her head against the seat back. If only she could enjoy the countryside, she thought, with that man so close to her. The train took a sharp turn and everyone was thrown to the right. The stranger's body pressed against Stephanie. She tried to move away, but her body was wedged between him and the doctor. The train straightened its course, but the man didn't move away from Stephanie. She turned to him. He was looking deep into her eyes. Just as she felt herself about to scream, he moved away from her. The train was puffing to a slow stop at a small village near Orsova. Suddenly, unbelievably, the dark stranger got up and left the compartment as quickly as he had entered it. They watched him as he stepped onto the station platform and walked toward a young woman who was sitting there. As the train drew away from the station, they could see the two kissing. Robert and Stephanie looked at each other and then started to laugh hysterically. Mrs. Archer smiled as she rearranged her things on the seat. The old doctor continued to smile at everyone. "You two are ridiculous," Mrs. Archer said to Stephanie and Robert. "Stop giggling." But then she laughed herself. "I think I'll go and wash up now," Mrs. Archer said. She stood up and turned around to reach for her bag on the overhead rack. After she got it down, she stopped to check her face in the mirror. In the reflection behind her own face, she saw Stephanie sitting alone on the opposite seat. "Why, where did the doctor—" she began to say, but when she did turn around, to her surprise, the doctor was still in his seat. How odd, Mrs. Archer thought, as the train plunged into another dark mountain tunnel. She sat back down again. The shrill train whistle pierced through the air. The rattle of the wheels on the tracks echoed throughout the tunnel. No other sound could be heard in the pitch blackness of the compartment. 3 minutes later, the train shot back out into the velvet blue twilight. "Stephanie!" Mrs. Archer shrieked. Stephanie was slumped across the seat, her head thrown back. Blood dribbled from 2 small holes in her neck. An unnatural smile played on her lips. "Doctor!" she sighed. But the doctor was gone, and a full moon shone brightly in the Transylvanian sky. It was the doctor all along! Who didn't see that coming? I mean, come on. Although the guy's behavior was kind of creepy. Also, yes, who doesn't like trains? You like trains! Am I sure it's Transylvania, not Castlevania? I mean, shit, it might as well be. Rip Stephanie. Okay. Simon Belmont? Fuck, well, he was off fighting Dracula in some other timeline or some other game. I guess technically, who's to say that this was Dracula, right? It could have just been any old vampire. Also, Dracula always keeps coming back anyways. I mean, it doesn't even matter. Simon Belmont can't ever fully kill him. Someone always brings him back in the end. Dracula's in another castle. Wah, wah, wah. I mean, as soon as you, she did the mirror, and it's like, huh, that's odd. Red flags. Okay. That is it for story time. I don't think I'm going to have time for another one of these because next week is the final week. and the game I'm going to play should take up the duration of the stream, I think. So I'm not planning for another one. So that might be it for the story time this year. We did 2 sessions of it. We still have a couple of stories left over. I'll just save them for next year at this point. I also might then have to pick out some of the other ones that are in this book to have a few to work from. Better extend your stream. No. Because as it is, if I go the full length, these things go till like 10 o'clock. Tonight's not going to go till 10 o'clock. I can guarantee you that. Yes, Captain, it is finally the flowers of fucking Robert Mapplethorpe. Here we go. So give me a sec here, guys. I'm going to do one more switch. And when we come back here, we'll have the final game for tonight.